And this is 10 Beautiful Things by Molly Beth Griffin. Lily ran her finger across the Iowa map. An X marked Graham's house on an empty patch of land, Lily's new home. Graham's car tires hummed against the pavement. Lily felt the vibration in her hollow chest. Let's try to find 10 beautiful things along the way, Graham said. Lily turned her eyes to the window. There's nothing beautiful here, she said. She struggled to fold the map so it nestled into itself just right. You'll be surprised, Graham said. And sure enough, at that very moment, the sun broke over the long horizon. Lily gasped. There's number 1, she cried. Right you are, Lily, said Graham. Fence post rushed past. Graham flipped on the radio, trying to fill the silence. Lily felt the complaint starting in her belly again, coming up her throat and nearly out her mouth. But then Graham shouted, number 2. A wind farm had sprouted in the field beside the freeway. Spinning windmill blades gleamed in the morning sun. Lily concentrated on the game and found number 3 real fast. A red-winged blackbird perched on a swaying stalk of last year's corn. It was dark and bright all at once, in its beak wide open in a song they couldn't hear. Later, Graham signaled and turned the car onto a smaller road. 2 more highways to go, she said. Lily popped a handful of crackers into her mouth, but food didn't fill up her hollow places. Graham cracked her window, and in rushed air and sound and cold. They crossed a bridge, and Graham chose number 4, the gurgly sound of a melting creek. Lily dozed off. She woke up when Graham tapped her knee and pointed out a falling apart barn. That's not pretty, Lily said. That can't count. We're not looking for pretty. We want beautiful, Graham said. So it stood, halfway to 10. At a rest area, Lily bounced out of the car while Graham stretched her creaky body. Lily picked number 6. The smell of mud, she said, inhaling. Graham shut her eyes and nodded slowly. It's earthy and rich, she said. I'd never really noticed. Lily breathed in the mud smell and focused on just that. It poured itself into some of the empty spaces in her. Back on the road again, the car seemed smaller. The humming in Lily had stopped, but her legs wanted to sprawl, and her stomach was getting queasy. We're on a roll now, Graham said, and she was right about that. 7 and 8 were easy. A cloud shaped like a swan, and a little brown calf that trotted beside the fence. Miles and miles later, they turned onto their last road, and the clouds began to draw close. The sky grew dark, the earth rumbled. Suddenly, the air exploded in bright flashes. Cloud banks traded lightning back and forth, showing off. Number 9, Lily whispered. There was no room for other words. The storm took up the whole world, and it filled Lily up too. She was here with Graham, and for a whole minute, that was all that mattered. On they drove. Almost there, not far now. When they'd been almost there for a long time, Graham braked, eased the car down a crumbling driveway, and parked in front of the farmhouse. "Here we be," she said through the drum of the rain. "Home." "But we only made it to 9, Lily said, slumping in her seat. "Nope, 10, easy." Graham came around with the umbrella and Lily stepped out of the car. "We're 10, Graham said. Lily sank into her familiar hug. None of this was easy. Maybe it would never be easy. But she belonged with Graham now. She belonged here now. This place wasn't empty, and neither was she.
If you let them, and I don't recommend you do, if you let them, guitarists will talk on and on about tone. The way the wood chosen for a guitar's body, the finish on that body, the type of pickups on the guitar, the string gauge, and any number of other factors will make precisely the same notes sound different, brighter, or warmer, or muddied, which to some people is a good thing. Humanism has been like that for me. See, I've been a humanist for decades, probably my whole adult life. I just never want to tell anybody I am. Yep, like humanists, other humanists, I do not believe in a supernatural entity or power that creates the universe or that controls the events that happen here. Like John Dietrich, a founding voice of Unitarian humanism, I embrace the idea that we, I mean humanity, are responsible for the litany of harms we have done and keep doing to each other and to the shared planet, but responsible too for the beauty we have added to it, the truths we wrestle with, the goodness we share and feed, and ultimately responsible for the potential to do better. A universalist, I share the humanist affirmation of the intrinsic value of all human beings. I believe in the language of the Third Humanist Manifesto, that human values derive from human welfare shaped by human circumstances, interests, and concerns extended to the global ecosystem and beyond. Actually, there is little in the Third Humanist Manifesto that I object to exactly, but there is also little or nothing in it that moves me. The notes are right, but the tone is off. Too bright, maybe. Not enough warmth. Maybe not enough depth. For me, the tone of humanism as I have experienced it most of my life, that's been the problem. Too individualistic, too cerebral, too optimistic, too self-assured, too certain, and often too condescending. And I'm not alone in this. I have known many UUs, some ministers in fact, who like me think they should be comfortable saying they're humanists, but for reasons they can't quite name, avoid the label. The UU minister William Murray wrote a whole book about it, seeking to infuse religious humanism with a sense of depth and of the sacred drawn from religious naturalism. A consistent problem with humanism, even religious humanism, Murray wrote, is that it comes across as dry and sterile and overly rationalistic. I would add to that, arrogant and dismissive. As humanist theologian Anthony Pinn notes, many humanists cringe at the very idea of a connection to, quote, anything that even hints at the religious, because religious belief is something to be looked down upon. For them, the religious religion is the structural trapping of small minds that imagine ghosts, gods, and other elements of superstition. That small minds and superstition attitude toward the religious matches the experience of many UUs, including UUs who are Christian or believe in gods of the Hindu or Buddhist or indigenous faiths. Rosemary Bray McNabb, a UU minister, a Black woman, and a Christian, recounts a moment at a coffee hour in Detroit when a white woman after church just walked up to tell her that as UUs, we have given up the notion of God. I've lost track of the number of times I've heard the equivalent assertion from members of this faith tradition, generally tied, implicitly sometimes, but sometimes very expressly, to the confidence that we, as opposed to they, rely on, what we rely on isn't some otherworldly power. No. What we rely on is human intelligence. Good luck. And finally, I've denied being a humanist because it has always seemed so individualistic. For UUs, this shows up as an interpretation of our third principle that sees that free and responsible search for truth and meaning as mostly an individualized search, one that is subject only to the fourth principle's freedom of individual conscience. Religion, though, is not a solo act. Religion is about what ties us together. To go back to my guitar analogy, more chords, fewer guitar solos. And I say that as a guy who likes a good guitar solo. But you see, even that analogy doesn't quite work because a guitar solo, even a really good one, sounds thin and empty without the rest of the band. So I don't like humanism. But honestly, I am a humanist. Well, shoot. That's a conundrum. And my path out of that conundrum began in Babel, in the strewn rubble of a fallen tower. In the biblical story of that tower, Nimrod, the great grandson of Noah, leads his people in founding the city of Babel, and then in building together a tower to connect with the divine. God saw what a community of people could accomplish, didn't like it, and so took away the people's shared language to keep them from completing this ambitious project. Now, one way to read that story is as a warning against human hubris. God telling us not to get too full of ourselves. And, hey, my fellow UUs, we could use that message. And that's the way it's almost always been read. But Anthony Pinn, who I mentioned earlier, a theologian of African-American humanist theology, and I believe a UU, he sees a different story. A story about a sort of communal humanism, a story that privileges creativity and the value of risk. See, in an attempt to build a tower to heaven, we have a story of humans pushing the limits of what we can accomplish together. Now, the story is cast, or at least interpreted, as a rebellion. And you know what? Maybe it is. But it isn't the story of a rebellion against God. It is a rebellion against fear and the way that fear restrains human communities. It is not, Pinn argues, a rebellion that demands freedom from God, but a freedom to develop meaning within the context of community. Nimrod's actions suggest a sense of interdependence, of mutuality, but one that allows humans to build their world, however compromised, however fragile those structures may be. For me, a key point here is that the biblical story of Babel doesn't focus on Nimrod as a villain, at least not on his own. No, says Penn, it is radical individualism. That poses no threat to God. No, the threat to God, and so the strength and potential in humanity, that comes from a freedom that is intermingled with attention to others. And that's when God comes down. So at the foot of that unfinished tower to heaven, Anthony Pinn showed me a different humanist path, a humanism of we rather than I. It's probably not a coincidence that I didn't see that path in humanism until I read the work of a non-white humanist. From the tower, Pinn points to a humanist theology that is both more communal and more humble than the humanism I have been pushing away for years. A humanism that says not that we will make the world what we will, as John Dietrich once said, but rather we do what we can, as we can, with what we have within reach of our human grasp. And that human grasp is expressed in community, not by individuals operating independently. The UU theologian Thondeka says that for a long time, Unitarian Universalism has clung to the idea that human essence is the mind, and the mind is independent from the body. There's a long history that I could trace in Unitarian Universalism that builds on that. And that has been the starting point for the humanism I keep avoiding. And it is just plain wrong. Not only is my mind not independent from my body, my mind isn't even truly independent from the bodies of the people, the animals, the world around me. Like it or not, the scientific reality is that we feel before we think. In the words of theologian Bernard Maitland, we live more deeply than we think. We are not purely rational beings. We are beings of affect, the pre-rational feeling of our relationship to each other and to existence. Thondeka calls this the neural content of the soul. The piece of us that knows at a deep, subconscious, human level that our existence and consciousness always entails the coexistence of the other. And the unity of the self is a collaborative achievement. Which I suppose is a fancy theologian way of saying, hey, we're in this together. Like it or not, we are interdependent. And when it dawned on me that humanism could recognize that interdependence, could embrace it, I started to think that I could be maybe more than a reluctant humanist. An interdependent humanism. Okay, that's good. That's good. But for me, it's not quite enough. I mean, sure, I can say, hey, I'm not a theist. I could simply say, I don't believe in God. But that says very little. It means even less. And maybe it isn't even true. I mean, to say I don't believe in God says nothing about what I do believe. It is an easy statement that lacks religious imagination. What even is this God I've chosen to disbelieve? What if the idea I've rejected isn't the only idea of God? God or gods can be imagined differently, can't they? In that imagining, might we find what it means to be human, to be interconnected and interdependent? Maybe. I mean, I don't think we will land on the meaning, the answer. I am a Unitarian Universalist, after all. But I think something better than that can happen. By widening our religious imagination, we find out the answers and the meanings and even the questions are ever shifting. We change them, and in turn, they change us over and over again. Come, come, whoever you are. To me, that is more than human, more than humanism. But I do not believe in God. And by that, I mean I do not believe in a supernatural power, an intelligent force, benevolent or otherwise, that exists outside the universe and somehow guides or controls us. The tower didn't fall because God knocked it down. The tower fell because not everything humans try to do, even when we try to do it together, succeeds. And so we try again. Or we try something else, knowing it might work and knowing that it might not. But that's a different sermon. My point here today is that while I do not believe in this God, I find humanism, even interdependent humanism, insufficient, too small to hold my religious imagination. What I do believe in is a kind of divinity. Not a divinity that is transcendent, a divinity that is beyond this world. No, divinity for me is immanent. It is this world. It is a constant reminder that we are in and of this world, that no matter how interdependent and interconnected we all are, there are spaces between us. What we do, what we say, whether we intend it or not, flows into those spaces, creates something that is more than human. What we shape in that space is what I call divinity. You might call it something else. Some probably call it God. Anthony Pinn, who has absolutely no interest in the word God, one of his books is The End of God Talk, also has no interest probably in the word divinity based on what I've read. He calls it an awareness and a feeling of and ... That's pretty good. But for me, divinity feels right. It imagines something connected to our humanity, our humanness, our shared existence, but also more than just adding up the people in the room. Humanism, yes, but divine humanism. Divine humanism. It imagines that a frightened child and her grandmother were not alone in a long ride to an old farm and a little girl's new home. There, too, was a shared power to find in the midst of fear and of change and of sadness 10 beautiful things along the road. To shape what beauty even means. To create beauty by seeing it together. And to realize that what existed between them, connected them, well, that was one of those 10 beautiful things. There lies divinity, a feeling of and. Whatever you call it, there is a lot of space there. And how we fill it, what we feed into it, matters. Divinity, as I think of it here, is not necessarily good or bad. It is ambiguous. We should not lull ourselves into thinking it is all goodness and truth and beauty. I love the Peter Mayer song I opened with this morning, but I cannot believe that everything is holy. The spaces between us will be fed and filled with something. A kind of divinity fills them at weddings and when we share our joys and sorrows here together. In the final goodbyes at a celebration of life. There was a divinity that filled the space between the marchers in Selma 60 years ago and among the hundreds of thousands who marched across the world after George Floyd was murdered. But divinity of an entirely different shape was there when Hamas soldiers snuck across the border and slaughtered more than 1,000 Israeli citizens. And it is there when Israeli soldiers bombed the civilian population of Gaza. On January 6th and September 11th, in school board meetings and the floors of legislatures terrorizing queer and trans kids. The divinities we shape and that shape us in return are formed as easily from hate and fear and insecurity as they are from love and compassion and mutuality. Often at the same time. It's messy. That's kind of my point. I name this ambiguous divine as a piece of my humanist theology because I hope it makes us examine our faith and our actions. We are shaping the divinities that fuel the spaces between us, whether we realize it or not, whether we name them or not. But we cannot choose which divinities to feed, which to place our faith in, unless we recognize that there is a choice to be made. Some divinities bring us closer to wholeness. Some tear us asunder. We will feed both. We're only human after all. So let it be the work of this church, of this faith, to be a religion that feeds love and wholeness as much and as often as we can, and that ties together what we have sundered in our moments of fear, hate, or indifference. Blessed be. May it be so, because we make it so.